The first hard frost reached Aspen Ford the same week. Susannah Crane ran out of fence posts. She was already past exhausted, that particular state beyond tired, where the body keeps moving. Only because stopping would mean thinking too clearly about how bad things had become. The north pasture fence had leaned through summer and September, and now with the ground stiffening, she needed to drive the last 6 posts before the earth locked solid. She had no one to help her. She had not had anyone to help her since Hugh died in March. That was the problem, or at least, the version of the problem the town of Aspen Ford had decided to believe. Hugh Crane had died on a Tuesday, and by Thursday the first whispers had begun. Fever, the doctor had written. Suspected typhoid, consistent with the outbreak near the river that spring. 3 other men in the valley had taken sick the same week. 2 recovered. 1 did not. Hugh Crane was the one. But Hugh Crane had also been a difficult man. Susannah had not spoken of that while he lived, and she did not speak of it after. She had stood at his grave with her hands folded and her face composed, and the town had watched her and found something wrong in her composure. They decided she was not sad enough. They decided she had not wept the right amount. One woman told another, who told the minister's wife, who repeated it with such careful caution that it spread faster than any loud accusation ever could. By midsummer, Aspen Ford had quietly concluded that Susannah had poisoned her husband. No one said it plainly. No one had to. The hardware store began to run low of the parts she needed. The feed merchant always seemed to be out of stock when she came in. At the church social in August, women moved away from her with small, gentle steps, as if proximity itself were a kind of endorsement. Only Edna Barlow, the old seamstress who lived at the far end of Mill Street, dared to be kind when it cost something. A bundle of turnips left on the porch. A folded piece of flannel tucked beneath a fence stone. Never a note. Never a name. Just the quiet insistence that one person in Aspen Ford still believed she was human. Mercy, Susannah had learned, was something you received in private, when guilt was too loud in the open. She was driving the 4th post when Roland Fitch came down the road. He was not a man who introduced himself quickly. He slowed. His cart looked at the fence line, looked at the post she was hammering, and then looked at the sky to the north, where the color had turned the particular gray-green that meant hard weather within 2 days. "Post is going in crooked," he said. Susannah did not stop swinging. "I know. Easier with 2 sets of hands. I've noticed." He set the cart brake and climbed down without being asked. He did not ask her name. He did not explain his own. He simply picked up the post, held it plumb while she swung, and then they moved to the next one. When all 6 were in the ground and the fence wire was run, he coiled the leftover wire and set it against the gate post. She stood watching him with her hammer still in her hand. "Roland Fitch," he said finally. "I run timber east of Cranberry Lake." "I know who you are," Susannah said. "I'm Susannah Crane." His expression did not change. If he knew what the town said about her, he gave nothing away. He looked at the fence line, checked one post with his boot, and nodded once. "That'll hold the winter," he said. "If you nail a cross brace at the gate." She studied his face the way a person learns to study things after being burned, looking for the thing behind the thing. She found only tiredness and a particular kind of quiet that belonged to people who had learned patience the hard way. "I didn't ask for help," she said. "No," Roland said, "but the post did." He came back the following morning with a cross brace already cut, a pail of cedar shingles for the henhouse roof she had been patching with rags and prayer, and enough nails to finish the job properly. He did not bring conversation. He brought his tools and his hands and his willingness to work, and that was enough. For 4 days, they worked alongside each other, in the way of people who share labor without needing to perform it. He replaced the cracked board in the barn wall. She mixed the mortar for the chimney flashing. He did not tell her what to do. She did not ask for his opinion. When a task required two people, they did it together without discussion, reading each other the way farmers read weather, by instinct, by observation, by the thousand small signals that words are too slow to carry. On the fourth evening, while the stove warmed a pot of split pea soup, and the sky outside pressed low and dark with the coming snow, Susannah spoke while she was looking at the fire. Hugh was sick because of the river, she said. The same water that took down a man named Perio and put another two in their beds for a month. Dr. Lask wrote it in his records. The town chose not to read the records. Roland did not interrupt. He held his mug with both hands and looked at the table. He was not a good man, she said then, plainly, as if she had been saving that sentence for a long time. He was not cruel every day. Some days were ordinary, but enough days were not, and I had learned to be very quiet about it. Outside, the first snow began to tap against the window glass. Roland set his mug down slowly. My wife's name was Coquette, he said. She got sick the winter after our son was born. I believed that working harder was the same as caring for her. I kept myself out in the timber because I didn't know how to sit with her in her fear. He paused. She died in spring. I wasn't there. Susannah looked at him then. He did not look away. I have not forgiven myself for it, he said. I don't expect you to offer me comfort about that. I only wanted you to know that I understand something about what silence costs. The snow thickened outside. They ate without speaking, and the quiet between them was not empty. It was the kind of silence that two people arrive at only after they have both told the truth. By the time the soup pot was empty, the snow outside had become serious, and Roland's road back to Canberra had disappeared under 3 inches of white with no sign of stopping. He stayed in the barn on a pallet of hay, and in the morning, half the road was drifted over. By the time the snow stopped and the road was passable again, Aspen Ford had already made up its mind about what had happened. Cecil Pratt had seen Roland's cart parked in Susannah's yard when he passed on his way to the mill. Pratt owned the general store and held half the credit accounts in the valley. What he chose to say, and what he chose not to say, shaped the fortunes of every family in Aspen Ford. And he understood this power the way some men understand it, as something to be used. He did not make an accusation. He simply described what he had observed, slowly, to the right ears, in the right order, with the right pauses. Roland Fitch, he noted, had spent at least one night in Susannah Crane's homestead. A widow woman. The Crane widow. He did not need to say more. When Susannah came to the store for lamp oil, flour, and a spool of wire, Pratt was behind the counter, with a ledger open and a smile that did not reach his eyes. I'm afraid your accounts come due, he said. I paid in September. There were additional charges. He turned the ledger so she could see a column of figures she did not recognize. With winter prices what they are, I can't continue extending credit to accounts in arrears. Susannah looked at the figures. She looked at him. My land is not in arrears, Mr. Pratt, and neither is my account. Pratt folded his hands on the counter. It is a difficult time for everyone. If you were to consider selling, the Crane parcel is a fair piece of ground. I might find flexibility. My land is not for sale. She left with nothing. That Sunday, Reverend Hollis stood at the pulpit, with his hands resting on his Bible, and his voice carrying that particular weight of a man who believes his discomfort is righteousness. He did not say Susannah's name. He spoke of widows who invited trouble by seeking comfort in the wrong quarters. He spoke of men who forgot their dignity in the service of charity, poorly given. He said it was a grief to him when the vulnerable became the occasion of scandal. Every head in the church turned slightly, and then turned back, and the effect was as precise as a pointed finger. Susannah sat 2 rows from the back, with her coat buttoned to the throat. Edna Barlow, across the aisle, gripped a fold of her skirt and did not look up. Bernard Lask, the town doctor, sat near the front and studied his hands. After the service, 3 men stopped Roland on the church steps. They were loud enough for the whole yard to hear. "Fitch," the first one said, "you've been spending time out at the Crane place." Roland stood with his hat in his hands. He could see Susannah 10 feet away, close enough to hear everything, close enough for her expression to matter. He felt the question, and he felt his own fear answer before his principles could catch up. "I did some fence work," he said, "nothing more." The words came out small and cowardly. He knew it before they finished leaving his mouth. Across the churchyard, Susannah's face went still in the way that surfaces go still when something beneath them hardens. She walked home by the back road, alone. Roland followed at a distance, keeping far enough back not to make it worse, which was the wrong instinct, though he wouldn't understand that until he was standing at her gate. "I was caught off guard," he said. Susannah turned from her porch. "No, you were caught being watched." He had no answer for that. "My husband made me small in private for years," she said, "and I said nothing because I thought silence was the price of surviving. But I have paid that price, Mr. Fitch. I have paid it in full, and I will not pay it again for the benefit of men who do not have the courage to be honest in daylight." She went inside. She came back to the door with his cedar shingles, his mallet, and his coil of wire. She set them outside on the step, one piece at a time. "Go home," she said. He wanted to explain. He wanted to argue his way back into her trust. But there was no argument to make, only the fact of what he had done, and the more important fact of why she was right to refuse him. He loaded his tools onto his cart and drove back to Cranberry Lake. That night, the temperature dropped hard. Susannah woke to the sound of movement in the barn, footsteps, then silence, then the fast sound of horses running. She took the lantern from the kitchen shelf and went outside. Her barn door was swinging open. Inside, the 2 dairy cows were restless. She lifted the lantern and looked, and found what she was not supposed to find. The main support post on the east wall had been sawn 3/4 through. Not enough to fall tonight, just enough to collapse under the weight of the first heavy snowfall. This had not been carelessness. This had been design. Susannah did not sleep. She sat in the barn until morning with the lantern burning, and the small hatchet her mother had left her resting across her knees. Roland arrived at first light with guilt hollowing out his face. He had turned his cart around twice in the night, then finally gotten out of bed at 4 in the morning and driven. He expected her to be asleep. He found her in the barn, eyes red from cold, the hatchet still in her lap. He looked at the sawn post. Something settled into his chest like iron. "Who did this?" he asked. Susannah looked at him steadily. "The kind of men who learn from cowards," she said. He stood with that for a long moment. Then he drove to town. Bernard Liesk was at his desk when Roland walked into the surgery without knocking. Bernard was a careful man, slow to speak, not given to drama. But he had been carrying something for months, and Roland had the look of a man who had finally decided to act, and that was enough to make Bernard set down his pen. Roland told him about Pratt's threats, the sawn post, his own failure outside the church. When he finished, he said, "I need to make this right before someone gets hurt." Bernard was quiet for a long moment. Then he opened his desk drawer and removed a folder of papers. He laid them flat on the desk between them. "I kept these because I believed they mattered," Bernard said. "I did not present them because the town had already made up its mind, and I was afraid of what it would cost me to say otherwise in public." He looked at the papers, then at Roland. "I am tired of what that fear has already cost her." The papers were his own medical notes from March. Hugh Crane had presented with high fever, joint pain, and dehydration consistent with the typhoid strain documented in 3 other Valley men that spring. There was no evidence of poisoning. There had never been any evidence of poisoning. There was only the evidence of illness, and the town had simply chosen not to look. Sunday morning, Roland said. Will you come? Bernard folded the papers carefully and held them against his chest. I will bring these, he said. On Sunday morning, Roland walked into the Aspen Ford church before the first hymn and stood in the center aisle with his hat held in both hands. The sound of the congregation died away to nothing. Cecil Pratt sat near the front in his usual spot. Reverend Hollis stood at the pulpit with his hands braced on either side of the lectern. Susannah stood near the back, her coat buttoned, one hand resting on the last pew, already planning to leave. Roland turned to face the congregation. I owe this community a confession, he said. Not about Susannah Crane, about myself. Susannah did not leave. I helped her because she needed help, and because she is an honest woman doing hard work without any assistance. This town should have provided long ago. When men asked me about it outside these very doors last week, I called it nothing. I made her decency into something I needed to apologize for, to protect my own reputation. His voice caught once and steadied. I lost my wife because I valued my pride over her need. I kept working when I should have been sitting with her. She died believing my silence was indifference. I nearly let the same cowardice destroy another good woman. He looked at Pratt. I am done choosing comfortable silence over plain truth. Pratt rose from the front pew. This is theatrics, he said loudly. This proves nothing. No, Roland said, looking straight at him. What it proves is that you have been using this pulpit and that ledger to run a decent woman off her own land, and I am no longer willing to pretend I don't see it. Bernard Liesk walked forward from his pew. He set the medical folder on the first step of the altar, open, where everyone could see the entries. I have Hugh Crane's medical records, he said, his voice steady for the first time in months. He died of typhoid, the same strain that killed a man named Perriot and sickened 2 others that same spring. I documented this in March. I should have made it public in April. He looked directly at Reverend Hollis. I am making it public now. From the far side of the church, Edna Barlow rose from her seat with the slow, deliberate movement of someone who has been waiting a long time. I saw 2 of Mr. Pratt's hired men at the Crane property 3 nights ago, she said. I was bringing a parcel of food. I am not a young woman and I move slowly, and they did not notice me. I know what I saw. She looked at Pratt without flinching. I should have spoken sooner. I am speaking now. The church was absolutely still. Reverend Hollis looked at the medical papers. He looked at Edna. He looked at Susannah, standing at the back of the room, and for the first time, seemed to see not the figure he had preached about, but the person who had been sitting in his church every Sunday since childhood, who had lost a difficult husband and a good reputation, and a full winter's worth of help, all because a story had been more satisfying than the truth. He stepped down from the pulpit. It was a small movement, but the whole church felt it. Mrs. Crane, he said, his voice stripped of its Sunday weight. I dressed gossip in the language of concern and called it pastoral duty. I caused you harm that I cannot fully repair. I ask your forgiveness before this congregation. Susannah held his gaze for a long moment. Write the correction, she said. Post it on the church door. Remove Mr. Pratt from any position that gives him influence over the accounts of this community. And before the next snowfall, send men out to repair my barn. Hollis bowed his head. Yes, he said, all of it. Pratt tried to leave through the side door. Bernard was already standing there, arms folded, with the unhurried certainty of a man who has made a decision and is not going to unmake it. You have done enough, Bernard said. To enough people. By afternoon, 3 wagons had rolled out to Susannah's homestead with lumber, nails, and the kind of labor that a community owes when it has spent months looking the other way. The barn post was replaced before dark. The fence line was squared and braced. 2 women brought preserves and flour and did not make speeches about it. Susannah stood in the yard and watched her neighbors do the work they should have done months ago. and felt something loosen inside her that she had not realized. She had been clenching since March. Roland did not position himself at the front of any of it. He worked on the barn framing without calling attention to himself, fitting boards with the same steady hands that had helped her drive fence posts in November. As if each nail were something he was still working out whether he had the right to give. He came to her door 2 weeks later with no prepared speech and nothing polished. He set a folded document on her table. "This gives you right of way across my timberland to the eastern creek," he said. "It adds a clean water source to your property and cuts your hauling distance by half. It's in your name, yours alone." Susannah looked at the paper, then at him. "I don't want to stand between you and anything you need," Roland said. "I want to be useful to you, if you'll allow it, in the way that two people can be useful to each other when they have decided to tell the truth and keep telling it." She did not forgive him all at once. That would have been easy, and easy was no longer something she trusted. Instead, she let the winter pass. She watched him come when he said he would come, and stay only as long as she wanted him there, and speak plainly in town about her good name and his own failings. She watched him be wrong sometimes and say so directly, without performing the wrongness, without turning his correction into something she was supposed to admire. By the time the ice broke on the creek and the pasture turned green again, she had stopped watching and started simply knowing. He asked her on a quiet evening in late April, standing beside the barn he had helped rebuild, in the long northern light that holds on and on in the prairie spring as if it cannot bear to leave. Susannah took her time. She looked at her land, the fields running green to the tree line, the fence posts standing plumb, the barn solid and square against the sky. She had kept all of it. She had kept herself. Then she looked at Roland, and she said yes, not as a woman who had been rescued, but as a woman who knew her own worth clearly enough to choose. That summer, Edna Barlow stood at the front of the ceremony, with a small bouquet she had picked from the roadside ditch, and Bernard Liask stood beside her, looking like a man who had finally set something heavy down. Reverend Hollis spoke the vows simply, without decoration, and no one in Aspen Ford whispered Susannah's name with anything but respect. In the years that followed, when people asked Susannah what had gotten her through that winter, she did not say love, and she did not say luck. She said the truth, told late and at great cost, by people who finally decided that the discomfort of speaking was smaller than the damage of silence. And she said she had learned the difference between a person who helps you in the dark and a person who stands beside you in the light, and that the second kind, rare as they are worth every cold morning it takes to find them.